The morning briefing room smelled like recycled air and stale coffee. Lieutenant Commander Thale adjusted his uniform as he walked through the sliding doors of Confederation Intelligence Headquarters. His 6-foot frame towered over most of his Alterian colleagues, though his species' naturally thin build made him appear fragile rather than imposing. The message on his communication device had been simple: report to Admiral Kane immediately for new assignment. Thale had spent 15 years analyzing military conflicts across the galaxy. His people, the Alterians, had evolved from peaceful herd animals on a world where cooperation meant survival. War to them was like a complex dance with rules that everyone understood. You moved your ships here, your enemy moved there, and eventually someone would have a clear advantage. The losing side would surrender with honor, negotiate terms, and both civilizations would continue existing. It was civilized. It was logical. Walking down the pristine white corridors, Thale passed holographic displays showing current conflicts throughout Confederation space. Most were minor territorial disputes or trade disagreements that would be resolved through careful diplomacy. Real wars, the kind that destroyed entire civilizations, belonged to ancient history. Modern spacefaring species had evolved beyond such primitive behavior. Admiral Kane was reviewing data files when Thale entered her office. She was a Centauran with the typical blue-tinged skin and large, dark eyes of her species. Like most senior officers in the Confederation Navy, she projected an air of calm competence. Wars were won through superior planning and technology, not through emotional outbursts or reckless behavior. "Sit down, Thale," Kane said without looking up from her holographic display. "I have an assignment that requires your particular expertise in military analysis." Thale settled into the chair across from her desk. Through the large window behind Kane, he could see merchant ships arriving and departing from the orbital station. Peaceful commerce flowing freely between dozens of worlds. This was what civilization looked like. "There's a new species that's caught our attention," Kane continued, finally looking at him directly. "Humans. They've recently developed faster than light, travel, and have begun expanding into nearby star systems. Unfortunately, they've also gotten into a conflict with the Drex Empire." Thale nodded. The Drex were known throughout the galaxy as aggressive but predictable opponents. They conquered worlds for resources and strategic positions, but they followed established rules of warfare. When they won, they were harsh but not genocidal. When they lost, they retreated and regrouped. They were, in their own way, civilized enemies. "Humans appear to be holding their own against Drex forces," Kane said, manipulating her holographic display to show a star map. "This is unusual, given their technological disadvantage. High Command wants detailed observations of human military tactics. We need to determine whether these humans could be valuable allies or potential threats to Confederation security." The assignment seemed routine to Thale. New species often showed initial promise in warfare through luck or desperation, but they usually settled into predictable patterns once they gained experience. "What makes this assignment special?" he asked. Kane paused, studying the data in front of her. "Initial reports from our automated monitoring stations suggest that human warfare techniques are unconventional. The automated systems have flagged several battles as containing errors in their tactical analysis. We need someone with your experience to provide accurate assessments." Thale had analyzed conflicts involving dozens of different species. Each had their own cultural approaches to warfare, but they all followed basic logical principles. You protected your most valuable assets, minimized casualties among your own forces, and sought victory through the most efficient means possible. Some species were more aggressive than others, but the fundamental mathematics of combat remained constant across all known civilizations. "I'll need a ship capable of long-term observation without detection," Thale said, "and access to all available intelligence on both human and Drex military capabilities." "Already arranged," Kane replied, handing him a data pad. The stealth reconnaissance vessel. Silent Observer is being prepared for departure. You'll have a full sensor suite and quantum communication array for regular reports. The mission duration is estimated at 6 months, though you're authorized to extend if necessary. Thale reviewed the mission parameters on the datapad. The contested region was the Gamma Hydri system, approximately 40 light-years from Confederation, space. Both humans and Drex had claimed mining rights to several asteroid fields in the system, leading to escalating conflicts. It was exactly the kind of resource dispute that typically resolved itself through negotiated settlement or decisive military action. Any special orders regarding contact protocols? Thale asked. Standard procedure was to maintain absolute stealth during observation missions, but some assignments required limited interaction with observed species. Strict observation only, Kane said firmly. Under no circumstances are you to reveal yourself to either side. Humans don't know we exist yet, and we want to keep it that way until we understand what kind of species we're dealing with. Reports will directly influence whether the Confederation approaches humanity with diplomatic overtures or defensive preparations. The weight of that responsibility settled on Thale's shoulders. His analysis could determine the future relationship between humanity and the dozens of worlds that comprise the Rigel Confederation. It was the kind of assignment that defined careers and shaped galactic politics. Walking back through the corridors toward the ship departure bays, Thale felt confident in his abilities. He had observed Krillian honor duels, Vagan siege warfare, and Andromedian fleet tactics. Each species had taught him something new about the varieties of civilized combat. Humans would undoubtedly prove interesting in their own way, but he expected them to fit within the established patterns of rational warfare. The Silent Observer was a sleek vessel designed for extended reconnaissance missions. Its hull was equipped with advanced stealth technology that could fool most sensor arrays, and its observation deck contained the most sophisticated monitoring equipment in the Confederation fleet. Thale would be able to record everything from wide-angle fleet movements to individual soldier communications. As the ship departed from Confederation space toward the Gamma Hydri system, Thale reviewed what little information was available about human civilization. They had evolved on a world they called Earth, developing technology rapidly after discovering faster-than-light travel. Their initial expansion into space had been peaceful, focused on colonization and resource extraction. The conflict with the Drex had begun when both species attempted to claim the same asteroid mining fields. Nothing in the preliminary report suggested anything unusual about human military doctrine. They appeared to follow standard tactical principles, using combined arms approaches with space-based and ground-based forces. Their technology was somewhat primitive compared to Confederation standards, but that was expected for a newly spacefaring species. 3 weeks later, as the Silent Observer took position in the outer reaches of the Gamma Hydri system, Thale prepared for what he assumed would be a routine observation mission. He had no way of knowing that everything he believed about the civilized warfare was about to be challenged by a species that had never learned the rules everyone else followed. The sensor alarm chimed softly as 2 fleets dropped out of hyperspace near the gas giant that dominated the Gamma Hydri system. Thale moved quickly to his observation station aboard the Silent Observer, activating the long-range scanners and communication intercept arrays. After 3 weeks of waiting, he was finally about to witness human military tactics firsthand. The tactical display showed him everything he needed to analyze the upcoming engagement. The Drex Empire had deployed a standard battle group. 1 heavy battleship, 4 cruisers, and 8 destroyer escorts. Their formation was textbook perfect, with the battleship anchored in the center and smaller vessels arranged in supporting positions. Total crew complement would be approximately 30,000 Drex soldiers. The human force was much smaller and appeared poorly organized by comparison. They had brought only 1 large ship that seemed to be their equivalent of a battleship. accompanied by 3 smaller vessels that looked like modified cargo haulers. Thale estimated their total numbers at maybe 8,000 humans. The technological disparity was even more obvious than the numerical disadvantage. Human weapons appeared to be basic plasma cannons and missile systems, while Drex forces carried advanced particle beam arrays and quantum torpedoes. This would be a short engagement. Thale began recording everything, expecting to document a typical example of how superior numbers and technology determine battle outcomes. The humans would probably make a token resistance, then surrender once they realized their situation was hopeless. The Drex would accept their surrender, take prisoners, and negotiate terms for mining rights in the system. It was exactly the kind of civilized warfare that had maintained galactic stability for centuries. The battle began as Thale expected. Both fleets maneuvered for optimal firing positions while testing each other's defensive capabilities with long-range shots. The Drex maintained their disciplined formation while the human ships moved in what appeared to be random patterns. Thale noted this in his initial observations, marking it as evidence of inferior tactical training among human commanders. The first major exchange of fire confirmed the technological gap between the two forces. Drex particle beams tore through human shields like they were made of paper, while human plasma cannons barely scratched Drex armor plating. Within minutes, the largest human ship had suffered critical damage to its engine systems and was beginning to list heavily to one side. What happened next would haunt Thale for the rest of his life. Instead of signaling surrender or attempting to retreat, the damaged human battleship suddenly accelerated directly toward the Drex formation. At first, Thale assumed this was a desperate attempt to ram one of the smaller Drex vessels, a last-ditch effort to inflict some damage before inevitable defeat. Such tactics were not unknown among warrior cultures, though they were generally considered primitive and wasteful. But the human ship wasn't targeting a destroyer or cruiser. It was heading straight for the massive Drex battleship at the center of their formation. The communication channels exploded with Drex voices as they realized what was happening. Orders flew between ships as the Drex commander tried to coordinate a response to this unprecedented maneuver. Heavy particle beam fire concentrated on the approaching human vessel, tearing huge sections of armor plating away and causing secondary explosions throughout its hull. The human ship kept coming. Thale watched in horrified fascination as the human battleship's crew continued to accelerate even as their vessel disintegrated around them. Internal communications intercepts revealed that they knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't desperation or tactical error. It was a deliberate choice to use their own ship as a weapon. The collision was visible even to the naked eye. A brilliant flash of light as 2 massive vessels and their crews were vaporized in a matter of seconds. The explosion was so powerful that it disabled the engines of 2 nearby Drex cruisers and sent shockwaves through the entire Drex formation. But the sacrifice had given the remaining human ships a tactical advantage. While the Drex fleet struggled to regain their formation and assess damage, the 3 smaller human vessels launched a coordinated attack on the damaged cruisers. Their inferior weapons suddenly became effective against ships with compromised shields and armor. Thale expected the humans to press their temporary advantage and then seek terms for honorable surrender. They had made their point, proved they were willing to fight, and inflicted significant damage on a superior force. Any rational commander would now negotiate from a position of relative strength. The humans did not surrender. Instead, they continued their attack with a ferocity that defied all logic. When one of their ships took critical damage, the crew didn't abandon it or try to withdraw for repairs. They overloaded their reactor and guided their dying vessel directly into another Drex cruiser. The second suicide ram eliminated another major Drex vessel and further disrupted their formation. The remaining 2 human ships used the chaos to launch boarding parties against the damaged Drex vessels. Thale watched through intercepted security feeds as human soldiers fought their way through corridors filled with toxic gases and unstable gravity fields. They moved forward even when wounded, even when their equipment failed, even when retreat would have been the sensible option. What disturbed Thala most was the way the humans communicated during combat. There was no panic in their voices, no desperate pleading for rescue or reinforcement. They spoke to each other with what sounded almost like excitement, as if they were enjoying the battle rather than simply enduring it. The engagement lasted 4 hours. When it ended, both sides had suffered enormous casualties, but the humans had somehow achieved a tactical victory. The surviving Drex vessels withdrew from the system, leaving the asteroid mining fields under human control. Thale stared at his sensor readings in shock. According to every military doctrine he had ever studied, the humans should have lost this battle decisively. They had been outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered from the start. Their victory should have been impossible. But they had won by doing something no other species had ever done. They had treated their own lives as expendable resources, using their ships and crews as weapons when conventional tactics failed. The mathematical equation that governed space combat had assumed that both sides would try to preserve their own forces while destroying the enemy's. Humans had changed the equation by removing the self-preservation variable entirely. As Thala began composing his first report to Confederation Command, his hands were shaking. He tried to find words to describe what he had witnessed, but the standard military terminology seemed inadequate. How did you explain to civilized people that there was a species out there that would choose mutual destruction over defeat? The debris field where the human and Drex battleships had collided was still glowing with residual energy. Thousands of beings had died in that collision, most of them humans who had followed orders to ram an enemy vessel. They had died singing their battle songs according to the intercepted communications. Thale realized that his mission had just become much more complicated. He was no longer simply observing the military capabilities of a potential ally or enemy. He was documenting the emergence of a species that fought wars according to rules that no one else in the galaxy understood or followed. The humans had won their first battle against the Drex, but Thale suspected this was just the beginning. If they could fight like this in a minor territorial dispute over mining rights, what would they be capable of when they faced a real existential threat? For the first time in his career as a military analyst, Thale found himself afraid of what he might learn next. The medical station's emergency lights cast red shadows across the corridor as Thale reviewed the latest intelligence reports. 2 months had passed since the first space battle he witnessed, and the conflict between humans and the Drex Empire had escalated far beyond a simple mining dispute. What had begun as skirmishes over asteroid fields had evolved into full-scale warfare across multiple star systems. Thale had repositioned the Silent Observer near Kepler Station, a small mining colony on the third moon of a barren planet that both sides now considered strategically important. The facility itself was worthless, producing barely enough refined metals to justify its existence, but its location made it a critical supply depot for further expansion into the contested region. The Drex had landed ground forces 3 days ago, intending to capture the station intact and use it as a forward base. Standard military doctrine suggested the humans would either evacuate their civilians and abandon the facility or surrender it to avoid unnecessary casualties. Mining colonies weren't worth fighting over when you could simply establish new ones elsewhere. Humans, as Thale was learning, did not follow standard military doctrine. Through his surveillance equipment, he watched human ground forces prepare their defenses around the mining complex. They had fewer than 2,000 soldiers to defend against 5,000 Drex troops, and their equipment was clearly inferior. Drex battle armor could withstand direct hits from human weapons, while human body armor seemed to offer minimal protection against Drex plasma rifles. The first assault began at dawn, local time. Drex forces advanced in perfect formation across the lunar surface, their movements coordinated and professional. They used suppressive fire to pin down human defenders while engineering units moved forward to breach the station's outer walls. It was textbook infantry tactics, executed with the precision that had made the Drex Empire a dominant military force. The human response violated every principle of defensive warfare that Thale understood. Instead of falling back to prepared positions when their outer defenses were breached, human soldiers charged forward into the advancing Drex formations. They left cover to engage enemies at close range, accepting casualties that any rational commander would consider unacceptable. But the most disturbing aspect was how individual human soldiers behaved when wounded. Thale watched through intercepted helmet cameras as a human marine with a severed arm continued fighting with his remaining hand. When his rifle ran out of ammunition, he used it as a club. When the rifle broke, he drew a knife and kept attacking, until he was finally killed. Another human soldier, badly burned by a plasma blast that should have incapacitated him, crawled toward a group of advancing Drex troops while pulling the pins from grenades attached to his equipment harness. The explosion killed him along with 6 Drex soldiers, and the psychological impact on the surviving Drex was immediately obvious. They began moving more cautiously, checking every piece of debris for potential human ambushes. The battle for the mining station lasted 16 hours. By the time Drex forces finally captured the facility, they had suffered over 2,000 casualties, while the human defenders had been completely eliminated. According to conventional military analysis, the Drex had achieved their objective and won a decisive victory. But Thale could see that the Drex commanders didn't consider this a victory. Their communications revealed shock and confusion at the human tactics they had encountered. Drex soldiers were trained to fight other rational beings who valued their own lives and sought to minimize casualties while achieving military objectives. They had never faced an enemy that seemed to view death as just another tactical option. The captured mining station was useless to the Drex. Human soldiers had systematically destroyed every piece of valuable equipment before the final assault, turning their victory into a collection of empty tunnels and twisted metal. Worse, the psychological impact on Drex forces was severe. Soldiers who had fought dozens of campaigns against other species now requested transfers rather than face humans in ground combat. 3 weeks later, Thale observed an even more disturbing engagement when Drex forces intercepted a human medical frigate that was evacuating wounded personnel from another battle zone. The ship was clearly marked with medical symbols and was broadcasting its non-combatant status on all communication channels. Under every civilized law of warfare, medical vessels were considered neutral and could not be targeted by either side. The Drex destroyer moved to intercept the medical frigate anyway, probably intending to search it for intelligence or military supplies. Such searches were technically legal under wartime protocols, though they were generally considered bad form when dealing with genuine medical vessels. What happened next would be impossible to explain to anyone who hadn't seen it themselves. The Drex destroyer closed to boarding range. The human medical frigate suddenly changed course and accelerated directly toward the much larger warship. The medical vessel was loaded with wounded soldiers and medical staff who were clearly non-combatants. Yet they chose to ram the Drex ship rather than allow it to be searched or captured. The collision destroyed both vessels instantly. Hundreds of wounded humans died in the explosion, along with the medical personnel who had been trying to save them. They had sacrificed themselves not to achieve any military objective, but simply to deny the Drex a minor intelligence advantage. The radio chatter from nearby human ships revealed that this decision had been made by the medical frigate's crew without orders from their command structure. They had chosen on their own initiative to violate their own non-combatant status and commit what amounted to suicide rather than risk being captured. Thale found himself physically ill as he reviewed the recorded communications from the medical frigate's final moments. The wounded soldiers aboard the ship had been singing as they accelerated toward the Drex destroyer. They knew they were going to die, and they were singing about it. The most terrifying aspect was that this behavior wasn't limited to desperate situations or last-ditch efforts. Thale documented dozens of similar incidents where humans chose death. Overcapture, destruction over surrender, and mutual annihilation over tactical withdrawal. They seemed to have no concept of acceptable losses or cost-benefit analysis when it came to combat. A human patrol would fight to the last soldier rather than retreat when retreat made tactical sense. Human ships would self-destruct rather than surrender when surrender would preserve lives and equipment for future battles. Human commanders would order their own positions bombed if it meant denying them to the enemy, even when those positions could have been retaken later. The Drex Empire had conquered 47 different worlds by following the same basic strategy. Demonstrate overwhelming force, offer reasonable terms for surrender, and then govern conquered territories with firm but fair administration. It was an efficient system that minimized casualties on both sides while expanding Drex influence throughout their region of the galaxy. That strategy was completely ineffective against humans. They couldn't be intimidated by overwhelming force, because they seemed to welcome the opportunity to fight against impossible odds. They couldn't be offered reasonable terms for surrender because they viewed surrender as fundamentally unacceptable. And they certainly couldn't be governed by any external authority because they would rather die fighting than live under occupation. As Thale compiled his reports for Confederation Command, he struggled to find appropriate language to describe what he was observing. Military terminology assumed that all combatants shared certain basic assumptions about the nature of warfare. You fought to achieve political objectives. You tried to preserve your own forces while destroying the enemy's. You accepted surrender when resistance became futile. Humans rejected all of those assumptions. They fought not to achieve specific political objectives, but to prove that they could not be defeated. They used their own forces as weapons rather than trying to preserve them. And they never accepted that resistance was futile, no matter how desperate their situation became. The war between humans and the Drex Empire was no longer about mining rights or territorial expansion. It had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a conflict between two completely incompatible approaches to existence itself. The Drex fought to expand their empire and improve their civilization's position in the galaxy. Humans fought to ensure that no one else would ever be able to make them stop fighting. Thale was beginning to understand that his mission parameters were no longer adequate. He wasn't just observing a military conflict between two species. He was documenting the emergence of a form of warfare that could fundamentally change the balance of power throughout known space. And he was starting to suspect that humanity might be more dangerous to galactic stability than any threat the Confederation had ever faced. Sleep no longer came easily to Thale aboard the Silent Observer. 4 months of observing human warfare had filled his dreams with images that his mind struggled to process. When he did manage to rest, he saw human soldiers charging through plasma, fire with missing limbs, human pilots flying their damaged fighters directly into enemy formations, and human civilians taking up weapons against professional soldiers rather than accept occupation. His sleeping quarters had become a makeshift research center filled with holographic displays showing human cultural databases that he had managed to access through intercepted communication networks. If he was going to understand why humans fought the way they did, he needed to understand how their minds worked. The answers he was finding disturbed him even more than the battles he had witnessed. The human homeworld, Earth, was what Galactic surveyors classified as a Class 12 deathworld. The planet's surface was dominated by extreme weather patterns, active geological instability, and an ecosystem where every life form seemed designed to kill every other life form. Humans had evolved not as the dominant predators on their world, but as persistence hunters who succeeded by simply refusing to give up when more powerful creatures would have retreated. Their entire evolutionary history was a story of overcoming impossible odds through determination rather than superior strength or intelligence. They had survived ice ages by adapting their behavior rather than migrating to more suitable climates. They had defeated predators that were faster, stronger, and better armed by hunting in coordinated groups that could outlast any individual opponent. Most importantly, they had developed as a species that viewed death not as the ultimate failure, but as an acceptable outcome if it served the survival of the group. Human parents would die to protect their children. Human soldiers would die to protect their communities. Human leaders would sacrifice themselves to preserve their civilization. This wasn't seen as tragic or heroic by human standards. It was simply normal behavior. The implications terrified Thale. Every other known species in the galaxy had evolved survival instincts that prioritized individual preservation. Even highly social species like his own Alterians would choose personal survival over group loyalty when faced with certain death. It was the foundation of rational behavior that made civilized warfare possible. Humans had evolved beyond such rational limitations. They could choose death over survival if they believed their deaths would serve a greater purpose. This gave them tactical options that no other species possessed, because no other species was psychologically capable of using those options effectively. Thale's analysis was interrupted by proximity alarms as another battle began near his observation position. This engagement was larger than any he had previously witnessed, with both sides committing significant fleet assets to control of a strategic choke point between star systems. The Drex had deployed 2 full battle groups, while human forces had assembled what appeared to be their entire remaining fleet. The tactical situation was hopeless for the humans. They were outnumbered 3-to-1 in ships, 5-to-1 in total firepower, and their technological disadvantage had become even more pronounced as the Drex adapted their weapon systems to exploit human weaknesses. Any rational analysis suggested that the humans should withdraw from the engagement and seek a negotiated settlement to preserve what remained of their military capabilities. Instead, the human fleet formed an attack formation and accelerated directly toward the center of the Drex defensive line. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a systematic demonstration of how a species could weaponize its own extinction instinct. Human ships that took critical damage didn't retreat for repairs. They overloaded their reactors and rammed the nearest enemy vessel. Human crews that found themselves aboard disabled ships didn't surrender or abandon their positions. They rigged their vessels to explode and took as many enemies with them as possible. The most shocking moment came when the human flagship, severely damaged and surrounded by Drex cruisers, began broadcasting a message on all communication frequencies. The human admiral was speaking directly to his own crew, and Thale recorded every word. "Today we die for something greater than ourselves," the human commander said, his voice steady despite the explosions that were tearing his ship apart around him. "Today we teach the galaxy that some things cannot be conquered, cannot be broken, cannot be defeated. We are human, and that means we choose how our story ends." The flagship exploded 17 seconds later, taking 3 Drex vessels with it. But the Admiral's message continued broadcasting from automated beacons throughout the battle zone, and its psychological impact on both sides was immediate and profound. Human forces fought with renewed intensity, as if their commander's words had freed them from any lingering concerns about survival or tactical restraint. They stopped trying to win the battle in any conventional sense and focused entirely on inflicting maximum damage on their enemies before dying. The Drex response was equally telling. Their communications revealed growing panic as they realized that every tactical advantage they possessed was meaningless against an enemy that had no interest in surviving the encounter. Drex captains began requesting permission to withdraw even when they held superior positions, because the psychological strain of fighting an enemy that welcomed death was breaking down their command structure. The battle ended with both fleets effectively destroyed, but the strategic implications were clear. The Drex Empire had lost far more ships and trained personnel than they could afford, while the humans had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They had proven that a numerically inferior force could defeat a superior enemy by simply being willing to pay a higher price for victory than their opponents could match. As Thale analyzed the engagement data, he realized that he was no longer observing a conflict between two civilizations. He was documenting the emergence of a military philosophy that could reshape the entire balance of power in known space. If humans could fight like this against the Drex Empire, what would happen when they encountered other species that threatened their interests? The answer came sooner than he expected. Intelligence intercepts revealed that several other galactic powers had been monitoring the human-Drex conflict with growing alarm. The Vegan Collective, the Andromedan Federation, and even the powerful Centauri Republic had begun classified discussions about the human problem and potential responses to this dangerous new military doctrine. Some advocated immediate diplomatic contact with humanity, hoping to establish peaceful relations before humans developed more advanced technology. Others suggested preemptive military action to eliminate the human threat while it remained manageable. A few recommended complete isolation, hoping that humans would eventually destroy themselves through their own aggressive tendencies. But all of these discussions revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what they were dealing with. Galactic. Leaders were trying to apply conventional diplomatic and military solutions to a species that didn't follow conventional rules. They assumed that humans could be reasoned with, intimidated, or defeated through superior force. Thal's months of observation had taught him that all of those assumptions were false. Humans couldn't be reasoned with because their decision-making process included factors that other species couldn't even comprehend. They couldn't be intimidated because they had no fear of death or suffering, and they couldn't be defeated through superior force because they would escalate any conflict to levels that their enemies weren't prepared to match. The most disturbing realization was that humans seemed to genuinely enjoy warfare in ways that other species did not. Their communications during battle contained laughter, singing, and expressions of excitement that suggested they found combat emotionally satisfying rather than simply necessary. They had evolved to find pleasure in activities that other species found traumatic. This raised questions that Thale wasn't qualified to answer. If humans could derive satisfaction from warfare, would they ever be willing to live peacefully with other species? Could a civilization that had weaponized its own mortality coexist with civilizations that valued survival above all else? Was it even possible to negotiate meaningful treaties with a species that viewed death as an acceptable negotiating position? As he prepared his latest report for Confederation Command, Thale realized that his mission had evolved far beyond its original parameters. He was no longer simply analyzing human military capabilities. He was trying to determine whether humanity represented the next stage of galactic evolution, or the greatest threat to galactic survival that any civilization had ever faced. The answer would determine whether the Rigel Confederation approached humanity as potential allies or prepared to face them as existential enemies. Either way, Thale was certain that first contact with humanity would change the galaxy forever. The quantum communication array crackled with urgent messages from Confederation Command as Thale watched the final phase of the human-Drex war unfold before his sensors. 6 months of observation had led to this moment. A massive human fleet, composed of every remaining warship they could field, was approaching the Drex homeworld of Drakmor itself. The audacity of the operation defied every principle of military strategy that civilized species had developed over millennia. Drakmor was protected by 3 rings of orbital defense platforms, each one capable of destroying entire battle fleets. The planet's surface was defended by planetary shields and ground-based weapons that could reach into space to target approaching vessels. Most importantly, the Drex home fleet comprised over 200 warships, many of them dreadnought-class vessels that individually outgunned anything in the human arsenal. No rational military commander would attempt a direct assault on such a heavily fortified position. The accepted strategy would be to blockade the system, conduct raids on outlying facilities, and gradually weaken the defenders over a period of years until they were forced to negotiate. It was how civilized species conducted warfare against peer opponents. The human fleet consisted of 87 ships, many of them severely damaged from previous engagements, and held together by emergency repairs and desperate ingenuity. Their crews were exhausted, their supplies were running low, and their technological disadvantage had only grown more pronounced as the war continued. By every measure of military analysis, they were attempting the impossible. They began their attack anyway. Thale watched in horrified fascination as the human fleet ignored the outer defensive rings entirely and drove straight toward Drakmoor's inner defenses. They absorbed devastating losses from orbital platforms without deviating from their course, leaving debris trails of shattered ships and scattered crew modules in their wake. When Drek's defenders moved to intercept them, human vessels rammed the enemy formations rather than engage in conventional fleet combat. The tactical communications between human ships revealed the true nature of their strategy. They weren't trying to conquer Drakmoor or even defeat the Drek's military in any traditional sense. They were conducting what they called a demonstration attack designed to prove that no world in the galaxy was safe from human retaliation. "Remember, what we're doing here," came a transmission from the human fleet commander as his ship took direct hits from 3 orbital platforms simultaneously. "We're not here to win. We're here to show them that their children will never be safe as long as they think they can fight us." The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Drek's defenders found themselves facing an enemy that had traveled hundreds of light years for the specific purpose of dying in their home system. Every conventional tactical response was useless against opponents who measured success by how much damage they could inflict before being destroyed. Human ships that lost propulsion used their remaining power to broadcast surrender demands to the planet below. Human crews that found themselves aboard disabled vessels continued fighting with hand weapons and improvised explosives even when facing overwhelming odds. Most disturbingly, human commanders began targeting civilian infrastructure on Drakmoor itself, violating every treaty and convention of civilized warfare. The Drek's response revealed the complete breakdown of their military doctrine. Units that had fought with disciplined coordination for decades began panicking when faced with enemies who seemed to view death as a tactical victory. Drek's commanders requested permission to withdraw from their own homeworld rather than continue, fighting an enemy that couldn't be reasoned with or defeated. The turning point came when a damaged human cruiser, its crew dead and its systems failing, somehow managed to penetrate the planetary shields and crash directly into the Drek's Imperial palace. The explosion was visible from space, and the symbolism was not lost on anyone involved in the conflict. Humans had proven they could reach any target in the galaxy if they were willing to pay any price to get there. The Drek's Empire surrendered 6 hours later. The surrender transmission was broadcast across the entire galaxy, and its contents shocked every military analyst who heard it. The Drek's hadn't been defeated in any conventional sense. They still had hundreds of functional warships, thousands of ground installations, and millions of trained soldiers. Their surrender was purely psychological, driven by the realization that continuing the war would mean facing an enemy that had no limits on what they were willing to sacrifice. "We cannot fight beings who make weapons of their own deaths," the Drek's Emperor said in his formal surrender message. "We cannot defend against enemies who find victory in their own destruction. The human species has proven that some forms of warfare transcend rational calculation. We yield not to their superior strength, but to their superior commitment to our mutual annihilation." The human assault on Drakmoor had cost them 63 ships and approximately 40,000 lives. By any standard military analysis, it had been a catastrophic defeat. They had lost most of their remaining fleet in exchange for minor damage to enemy installations and the destruction of a single ceremonial building. But they had won the war. As Thale began composing his final report, he realized that everything he thought he understood about military science had become obsolete. The humans had demonstrated that psychological warfare could be more decisive than technological superiority, that the willingness to die could be more powerful than the ability to kill, and that a species with nothing left to lose could defeat opponents who still had something to protect. The implications for galactic stability were staggering. Within days of the Drek's surrender, every major power in known space had begun emergency sessions to discuss the human question. The Centauri Republic established a special committee to study human military doctrine. The Andromedan Federation began developing new defensive strategies based on the assumption that future enemies might employ human-style tactics. The Vegan Collective quietly initiated research programs to determine whether their own species could be trained to fight with similar psychological commitment. But Thale understood that all of these responses missed the fundamental point. Humans hadn't won through superior training or advanced psychological conditioning. They had won because their entire evolutionary history had prepared them for warfare in ways that no other species could replicate. You couldn't teach rational beings to embrace death as enthusiastically as humans did, because rationality itself prevented that level of commitment. The war's end brought Thale no relief from his nightmares. If anything, they intensified as he realized what he had witnessed. He had documented the emergence of a species that could fundamentally alter the balance of power throughout the galaxy, simply by being willing to fight wars that no one else could win. His final report to Confederation Command was the most important document he had ever written. In it, he tried to convey the magnitude of what humanity represented to galactic civilization. Humans do not wage war to achieve political objectives, he wrote. They wage war to convince their enemies that fighting humans is too psychologically devastating to be worth any conceivable victory. They have weaponized their own mortality, turning their biological limitations into tactical advantages that no rational opponent can counter. Any species that goes to war with humanity should be prepared not just for military defeat, but for the kind of warfare that will fundamentally change both civilizations forever. Humans fight not to win territory or resources, but to ensure that their enemies never feel safe enough to threaten them again. The Confederation faces a choice. We can approach humanity as potential allies, hoping to benefit from their unique capabilities while avoiding their hostility. Or we can prepare to face them as enemies, knowing that such a conflict will be unlike anything in recorded galactic history. I recommend immediate diplomatic contact with human leadership, not because they represent a military threat that we cannot handle, but because they represent a form of warfare that we cannot comprehend or effectively counter. It is better to have humans as friends than to discover what they are capable of when they view us as existential enemies. 3 days after transmitting his final report, Thale submitted his resignation from active duty. He had served the Confederation Navy for 15 years, analyzing dozens of conflicts and providing strategic assessments that had shaped military policy throughout their region of space. But he could no longer function as a military analyst after what he had seen. His dreams were filled with images of human soldiers who sang as they charged into certain death, of human pilots who smiled as they guided their ships into enemy formations, and of human civilians who preferred mutual destruction over foreign occupation. He had witnessed a species that treated warfare not as a necessary evil, but as an expression of their fundamental nature. The Confederation quietly initiated diplomatic overtures to Earth within a month of receiving Thale's report. They approached humanity not as potential subjects or allies in the traditional sense, but as a species that needed to be understood and accommodated rather than challenged or controlled. The alternative was too terrible to contemplate. As Thale settled into retirement on his homeworld, he often wondered if other species in the galaxy would be able to adapt to the new reality that humanity represented. Could civilizations that had evolved rational approaches to conflict coexist with a species that viewed irrationality as a tactical advantage? The answer would determine whether the galaxy entered a new era of unprecedented peace or unprecedented destruction. Either Thale was certain that no one who had witnessed human warfare would ever be able to forget what they had seen. Late at night, when sleep eluded him entirely, Thale would often think about the human soldiers he had observed through his surveillance equipment. They had died in ways that defied every survival instinct that evolution had programmed into rational beings. But they had died with something that Thale's own species had never possessed: the absolute certainty that their deaths would serve a purpose greater than their individual survival. Perhaps that was humanity's greatest weapon of all, not their willingness to die, but their ability to find meaning in death that made dying worthwhile. It was a power that no other species could fully understand, and therefore a power that no other species could effectively defeat. The galaxy would never be the same.